Let's start by forwarding the user to a different route once the user is logged in. Now, since we always want to redirect the user once we authenticate it, we of course can do this in two different places. We can either do it here in handle authentication, or we do it in the component here inside of subscribe, in the success case only, of course. Now, it's up to you when you do that. If you prefer redirecting in the component or from inside a service. Both is valid, and if you need no data from either the service or the component and you have no strong reason for doing it in one place or the other, it's totally up to you where you do that. Now, you could argue that you want to keep your service a bit cleaner and don't interact with the user interface in the service, so don't directly influence the user interface, and therefore you maybe don't want to interact with the router in here, though I see no problem with doing that, and we did it before in the course as well. Nonetheless, to mix things up, here I will do it in the component, and I will inject the router, the Angular router, which is injected from @AngularRouter. And with the router injected in the auth component, here in subscribe, but only in the success case, of course, I want to use the router and navigate to /recipes like this. This is a great example for programmatic navigation now, where you couldn't use a link in the template because you want to navigate once some action is done, and you don't want to navigate when a user clicks something, but only once the user clicked the button and the login is done. Therefore, we need to navigate from inside code because this is where we know once this is done. So now let's give this a try and let's see if it works. Let's try logging in. And we go to recipes. Great. Let's now try to create a new user. So here with test2, switch to sign up and click sign up. And this works too. So navigating works. Of course, we still can go back to authenticate because we still have it here in the header. And on the other hand, if we're not authenticated, for example, if I reload the app, then all the previous state is lost and we're not authenticated because the user object doesn't exist anymore in memory. We'll soon add something to persist it, but for now, that's how it is. So even if we're not logged in, we still see recipes, even though we don't really want to be able to go there. So the next step will be that we correctly reflect our current status here in the UI, and that in this application mostly means in the header. In the header component, if we have a look at the HTML code, in the end, the goal will be to disable this recipes link if we are not logged in, to disable the authenticate link if we are logged in, because there is no sense in logging in again if we are logged in, right? To always show the shopping list, to disable the dropdown if we are not logged in, because saving and fetching data is only available if we are logged in, and to also show a logout button that allows us to, log out. Let me start with the logout button here. For that, I'll add a new list item here, and in there, an anchor tag, where I say logout, without any reference or router link set, just like this. Now let's also add this style here to make sure we get a nice cursor when hovering over that, but that's of course totally optional. Now we have that logout button here, and now we need to make sure we get the current authentication status into the header component. So we basically find out, do we have a user with a valid token or not? And we then also need to use that information to update the template correctly. Now, for that, first of all, in the auth service, right now we manage our user here through a subject. This will inform all places in the application about when our user changes. And right now, even though we haven't implemented all the logic for that yet, let's assume that it always changes when the authentication status changes. So even if the token expires, the user subject will emit a new value, which is then null, because then the user is invalid. We haven't added that logic yet, but we will add it. So let's assume that the subject here is our source of truth, and therefore the header component, since it's always there in our application, can subscribe to that subject to update correctly based on the user status. So in the header component TypeScript file, we can now inject the auth service, which is of type auth service, of course, and you need to import auth service from that path. And we can then add ng on init by adding the on init interface here. which is also imported from @AngularCore. And inside of ng-on-init, I want to set up a subscription to this auth service user. So we can set up a subscription here. And as you learned in the RxJS section, such subscriptions should be managed by you so that you unsubscribe if it's not required anymore. For that, I'll add a new private property user sub, which is of type subscription. And subscription is imported from RxJS, so this import needs to be added to the header component. And with that added, we store the subscription in that user sub property. And now also add on destroy here, which is also imported from @AngularCore, so that we are forced to add ng-on-destroy where we can clear that subscription. So here I call this user sub unsubscribe. The more interesting part for us, of course, happens inside of subscribe here, because there we get a user object. And now, as I mentioned, let's rely on the fact that this user is either null if we're not logged in, or exists, so if it's the user object is not null, but it's a concrete object, if we are logged in. So if we have a user, we are logged in. That's the core idea. Therefore, let's add a new property here in this component, which you could name is authenticated. Of course, the exact name is up to you. And let's assume by default that is not the case, so it's false. Is authenticated is false. Here, in this subscribe function, when we get a user, we then set this is authenticated equal to a check. If not user, then I want to set the value to false, because then we are not authenticated if we have no user object. Otherwise, it's true. Now, this is the check I want to have, and we can actually shorten this. We can write not user. This might look strange, but it's a little trick where we basically check if we not have a user, which will be true if the user is null and false if we have a user object. But that is the opposite of what we need. Hence, I add an extra exclamation mark to then inverse this value and get true or false. To be precise, I get true when we have a user and false if we have no user. And in case you want to see what's happening there, simply console log not user and then console log not user, and you will see what's happening here. So with that, we change is authenticated. Now in the header component, we can use that property to update it appropriately. Recipes should only be visible if we are authenticated, and therefore with ngIf, we can make sure it's only visible if is authenticated is true. So ngIf is authenticated is added to this link, or actually not just to the link, but to the entire list item here. The authentication link here, on the other hand, should only be added if we're not authenticated. So add an exclamation mark in front of is authenticated. Shopping list should always be visible, so nothing needs to change here. Logout should only be visible if we are authenticated, because if we are not authenticated, we clearly can't log out. So this should only be visible if we are authenticated, so without an exclamation mark here. Now this drop down here should also only be visible if we are authenticated, because if we're not authenticated, we can't fetch and store data anyways. With that, if you save this and this reloads, you should only see authenticated and shopping list as a default, because we start non-authenticated. But now if I do log in here with valid credentials, this changes and you see the user interface also changes. You see now we have recipes, we have shopping list, we have logout and so on, and we don't see the authenticate page anymore. Clearly, we can reach it if we manually visit /auth, and this reloads the app anyways and loses our authentication status, by the way. But that's a different thing. The important thing here is that the user interface updates correctly. Now, with the user interface updating correctly, before we work on things like storing the token and protecting certain routes so that we can't visit them even if we directly enter the URL, before we dive into that, let's make sure we now actually can use our token to fetch data, because that is still not working, even though we are authenticated. Why?